Well, it's been a while. I have no excuse whatsoever. I really don't know what to say. So, I guess we should just get into this before too long. So, yeah. Hello, everyone. Britton here, also known as Some Okie Dude, and I'm back with the third episode, the much long-awaited third episode of The Fate of Fantasy, where we talk about all things fantasy and fantastical, and we got ourselves a good episode today. I know it's been a while since I made an episode of The Fate of Fantasy, and I'm real sorry about that. On the one hand, I just got really busy with life and school-related stuff, but I'll be honest, I got a case of I don't know if I want to call it a writer's block or just a block in general, but that happened to me. And that I really don't know how to describe it aside from the episode that I was going to do for the third episode just wasn't coming through. And to be honest, I didn't really know what to do. I hit a roadblock. So I couldn't really figure out the angle that I wanted to take for the episode that was going to be episode 3. But don't worry, that episode I do hope to get out some point in the near future. But I decided to do this episode because I have been asked by some friends recently on what books they should start with if they want an introduction to the fantasy genre. A loaded question, to be sure. And one that has a number of answers from different fantasy enthusiasts. I mean, you can find, like, Philip Chase and Library Ladder have made videos on this. I think Library Ladder's made a video on this. But there are different videos around the internet. I'll probably link some down below if you want to read about the origins and also just some good fantasy books to get started with. It's a very common video idea. But with this video, I tried to think in terms of the impact that the books I'll be talking about had, as well as what I personally would recommend as good starters for the fantasy genre. I also tried to think about accessibility, so I didn't really pick anything like Malazan, because I haven't really read much of Malazan except for the first book here, which I'm hopefully going to finish soon, and the Dark Star trilogy, sad as I was to leave that out. I'm sure this is obvious, but in case it isn't, these are my personal picks, so if you disagree or don't like this list, feel free to make your own. Or let me know in the comments what you think your starter fantasies would be. So, yeah, let's get to it. Fantasy. Despite the tropes and cliches that we've come to know and love about the genre, it's actually a very diverse and multi-layered genre with different traditions of storytelling, which I will be talking about throughout this series. I mean, it's a genre where people like Susanna Clarke, China Miéville, and Joe Abercrombie can write wildly different books and still be called fantasy without a shadow of a doubt. And so that should tell you everything you need to know, right? So as I said in the first episode, fantasy at its core is the literature of the imagination. And that's honestly where I would start any list when it comes to recommending fantasy for beginners. There are certainly plenty of places to choose from, and my friend Sam from iSamwise made the excellent point where much of the classic fantasy literature come from sources where the people of those eras where they were written thought this was real, this actually happened. And I think that could be a really good episode on its own merit. So I won't really get too much into that today. But these, specifically, are the books and stories that I would recommend as great starting points for people who are curious about fantasy and how they would like their journey as fantasy readers to begin. So let's get to it. So for my recommendations, they will be in 2 sections. One will be classics, where I'll briefly go over some classic pieces of literature that I think would be good starts for fantasy fans, and then 5 novels that I think would be really good start for fantasy fans. So for potential fantasy readers or fantasy fans, I digress. So yeah, I guess we should get into it before too long. I don't really have too much to say, so let's just get the classics out of the way. So, the first classic that I'll talk about briefly is The Odyssey by Homer. This is technically a oral story that was told down from the generations until Homer finally got the good idea to write it all down. But aside from the Bible and the other book that I'll be talking about on this classics list, this is probably the most influential story in human history. Now, I will say, technically, it is a sequel to a book called The Iliad, but I do think The Odyssey can be read on its own. And it's also just a damn good ripping yarn about a guy called Odysseus who is just trying to get back home after a torturous and eventful war that happened in the Iliad. But I don't think you need to read the Iliad in order to understand the Odyssey. And I actually think the Odyssey is a lot better than the Iliad. I mean, I like the Iliad, but I just find the Odyssey really sticks out better for me. And also, a lot of the tropes that we would come to know from fantasy really originated here. So, yeah, not really much else to say. Check out the Odyssey. The second book I'll be talking about in the classic section is Beowulf. I'm sure a wild Philip Chase will appear. But yeah, if the Odyssey is from where a lot of the fantasy tropes came from, the rest of the fantasy tropes that we all know and love came from Beowulf. It's also, again, kind of like the Odyssey, just a really fun ripping yarn. It's also just a lot of fun. I really enjoy Odysseus. I enjoy Beowulf's adventures as he goes on adventures, killing monsters, killing the monster's mom, sometimes punching creatures in the face, punching sea creatures in the face, and he even bear hugs a guy to death. It's a lot of fun. But it's also, as Philip Chase quite nicely put it, it's also a lamentation of a time going past. And we see the old pagan ways going away as the new Christian way is coming in. And yeah, Beowulf is just great. I highly recommend the Seamus Heaney edition for those who want something. It's probably the most accessible version of the story, and it's also just really good. So yeah, go check it out. And the third classic I'm going to get out of the way real quick is the Epic of Gilgamesh. I read this in college. And aside from the Odyssey and the Bible, this is on the big three of the greatest, most influential stories in human history. And I read this in college, believe it or not, and I was very surprised seeing that a lot of it really cuts to the heart of what fantasy is and why we have myths and why we have fantasy. Particularly to come to terms with our own mortality, and that's really what the Epic of Gilgamesh is about. But yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh is also a lot of fun. Lots of fights. There's a really good friendship arc. There's also a love story in the middle of it. And there's even a really sad moment where our main character mourns the death of one of his friends. Really, really great stuff. Those are the classics. Those are the classics I recommend. So let's get to the novel, shall we? So, okay, the first novel I'll talk about is by one J.R.R. Tolkien, but before people think Lord of the Rings, I actually think that The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien is a much better place to start. It's a relatively standalone, very straightforward story of young Bilbo, well, not young, but Bilbo Baggins as he goes on an adventure with a crew of dwarves as they try to take down the dreaded dragon Smaug. And it's really good, actually. I actually reread it not too long ago, and it still holds up. It actually has some of my favorite characters of the Tolkien legendarium, particularly Thorin. I love Thorin. I think he's one of Tolkien's best characters. Very complex, very flawed. If you're a fan of some of the grimdark fantasy with, the very flawed, conflicted characters, you'll probably get a real kick out of Thorin. And Bilbo's also a very likable character, too. You also see characters like Gandalf and Legolas and some of the other elf characters show up. Galadriel, I think, makes an appearance, if I recall right. But I think The Hobbit is really the best start for anyone who is curious about J.R.R. Tolkien's style because it is relatively standalone, and it's also a very straightforward story. It does get epic in some parts, and yes, this book was initially meant for kids, but I do think anyone of all ages can appreciate what J.R.R. Tolkien is doing with The Hobbit, and it's not quite as overwhelming as the Lord of the Rings can sometimes be because of just how intricate the world building is in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And also, Tolkien doesn't go on his asides as much in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, in The Hobbit, sorry, not Lord of the Rings trilogy, as he does in Lord of the Rings is what I meant to say. What I meant to say is he doesn't go on as many asides in The Hobbit as he does in Lord of the Rings, So if people are kind of, a little turned off by how much, Tolkien likes to meander sometimes, I would highly recommend The Hobbit. It's definitely a great place to start if you're curious about the Legendarium. And also, it doesn't really require a lot of foreknowledge to understand. And Lord of the Rings is a pretty standalone trilogy as well. But I think The Hobbit is great because it's a good one to dip your toes in. If you're curious about Lord of the Rings, you may have seen the movies, but you're kind of intimidated by the books. Read The Hobbit first. If you like The Hobbit, read Lord of the Rings. But I think The Hobbit is a better starting place for J.R.R. Tolkien than Lord of the Rings. And, I mean, for my money, I've said it before and I'll keep saying it, but J.R.R. Tolkien definitely is the most influential fantasy writer who has ever lived. I mean, his impact reaches large, and every single writer who has come after him is either trying to mimic him or refute him in some levels, with some exceptions, like Steven Erikson, for example. Hopefully he doesn't watch this. He'd probably get upset at me for saying that. But for the most part, I think that The Hobbit would be a great place to start for anyone who is interested in the Legendarium, but also is a good place to start in your fantasy journey as well. Because, again, very straightforward story. Not a lot of context is needed. I mean, if you want to read context, that's fine. But it's generally very straightforward. You don't have to read a bunch of stuff to understand it. Just go into it, have a good time. It's a great story. And if you love the Shire in the Lord of the Rings movies, it's all over this book. So, yeah, give it a shot. It's a great book. The next book I'm going to be talking about, series, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's a bit odd, but I'll get into it. But that is Conan the Cimmerian by Robert E. Howard. Aside from J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard is probably the second most influential writer of in the fantasy genre, aside from J.R.R. Tolkien. Every writer that came after is really either responding to Tolkien or Howard in some way or another, unless you're one of those weird people like Steven Erikson who just kind of does his own thing in the corner. But Conan the Cimmerian, I think, I will admit, some of the stories have aged. I mean, they were written in the 30s. There are certainly some outdated opinions about race and women and whatnot, and that might offend some more sensitive readers. But I think if you look past that, they're really fun, really engaging, very well-written yarns, and also, they're short stories. So, not a big commitment, and you can read them in about a day or so. And they're also just really well done. I really love how Howard writes. I love the intensity of his language. I love the intensity of his action sequences. I mean, the man could write action sequences like nobody else could. And he was basically immortalized, Conan was, by the art of the great Frank Frazetta, of course. But Conan the Cimmerian, I think, is probably the most influential fantasy aside from Lord of the Rings because of how many people came after Conan trying to recapture that magic in a bottle. But to keep the impact out of the way, I think they're just really damn good, really fun stories that still hold up, I think. Again, there are some stuff that have aged. This was written in the 30s, after all. But none of these stories are bad, at least the ones that I have read so far. And there's some truly brilliant storytelling from Robert E. Howard that many of the people who came after him just couldn't replicate because his voice was just that unique. He's definitely my favorite pulp writer, and if you're a fan of pulps or are kind of curious about pulps, Robert E. Howard would be a really great place to start. I really love Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian, as he's better known. The movie from the 80s with Arnold is solid. It doesn't quite capture everything about who Conan is, but definitely check out the books. I definitely would recommend the Del Rey editions of Conan, which are 3 books. It has all the stories written by Howard as they were intended. No one touched them. No one tampered with them. All of it is Howard's material. There's also like a big volume that came out a few years ago that is also apparently really well received, but I prefer the Del Rey editions because those are all Howard's words without anybody tampering with them. I really don't have anything else to say on that, so yeah, moving on. So maybe you want something a little modern, because I've talked about two books that are pretty old and might turn off some newer readers. So for my money, there are two people who are the most influential in how modern fantasy is being written today, and one of them is George R. R. Martin, and I am talking about A Song of Ice and Fire. I definitely recommend this series for people who want something a little darker, who want something a little more mature, who definitely want something that is epic, is definitely on the scale of something of a Tolkien, but definitely more refitted for modern audiences. And for my money, the best epic fantasy of the modern day is still A Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, it is not finished yet. I know that, and it still makes me sad to this day, but I think that George R. R. Martin's supremely skilled writing and superb characterization makes A Song of Ice and Fire well worth the read. And also, it's just a damn good story all around. I really love the characters. I love the setting of Westeros. I love the history. And just, again, just the journeys that the characters go on in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire is particularly well done, and it has influenced all of the fantasy that has come after. I mean, Joe Abercrombie wouldn't be doing what he does, Mark Lawrence, John Gwynne, many of these so-called grimdark writers. Well, I don't know if John Gwynne is technically a grimdark writer, but anyway, many of these writers who are kind of in this more darker, or I like to call it gritty fantasy, because I don't really like the term grimdark all that much. But many of the gritty fantasy authors who came afterwards really owe their existence to George R. R. Martin. I mean, A Song of Ice and Fire, though, is supremely crafted epic fantasy with politics, action, war, romance, all the stuff. It is basically everything you want in an epic fantasy. And even though it's not finished, and that's just going to, it's probably not going to be finished anytime soon, I still think it is well worth the read, because I think George R. R. Martin is just really skilled at pacing. He is really skilled at plot. He's also just a really good storyteller, and I think that A Song of Ice and Fire is his magnum opus. It's definitely the book that it's definitely the series he'll be remembered for when he dies, for better or for worse. I would like to read some of his other books at some point, but, I digress from the point. But A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely the best modern epic fantasy that I've read. Really no notes I have whatsoever. I mean, there are dozens of videos and conversations and analysis of Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire. I really won't go into that here. Someday, I hope we get a somewhat of a finish, but I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. So, yeah, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin would be my third pick. My fourth pick is the other author I would say is probably the most influential fantasy author who has worked today, and that is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. Now, I know Neil Gaiman is not everyone's favorite person at the moment. I get it. I won't go into that, because I've already talked about it a little bit on my channel, so I won't go into that. But I tried to think of a Gaiman book that I think would be accessible for most people, and I would say Coraline would be that book. It's kind of his take on the fifth book that I'll be talking about here, but kind of like The Hobbit. Yes, it is a story that is meant for kids, but I think adults can enjoy it just as well. It's very dark, it's very macabre. There's a lot of really great atmospheric work that Gaiman does with Coraline. It's also just a damn good story that I think can be applicable to children and adults equally. And Gaiman is also one of the people who showed that fantasy did not have to follow in the Martin and Tolkien models of fantasy storytelling in order to be a success. Definitely, I don't think authors like Susanna Clarke or China Miéville or Jeff Vandermeer or so many others I could think of, Brian Catling, Marlon James even for that matter, even though Marlon James is pulling a lot from Sword and Sorcery in his series. But I don't think any of those authors, Catherine Valenne, even though I didn't really care for Deathless, none of those authors could have done what they did and made a success of it. V.E. Schwab is another one as well. I don't think any of those authors could have made a success as much as they have, if not for Gaiman's efforts first. I think if stuff like The Sandman didn't prove successful, I don't know if we would have gotten any of those books like Perdido Street Station or Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or Deathless, or The Vor, or Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I highly doubt we would have gotten any of those books if not for books like Coraline. But even then, Coraline is a very straightforward, very short book. You could probably read it in a day or two. And if you're really interested in that kind of dark, macabre kind of fantasy, something kind of like Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is another book I would recommend for this list. But, I digress. That could be another, that's an honorable mention, we'll say. But Coraline by Neil Gaiman is definitely one that I would recommend because it's very accessible. It's probably Neil's most accessible, or Gaiman's, I should say. It's probably Gaiman's most accessible book, aside from maybe, I don't know, The Sandman, probably, which The Sandman would also be a good pick, but that's comic. I won't get into the comics field. That's for another time. But yes, Coraline by Neil Gaiman, I think, would be a great start for anyone who may not be as interested in the kind of Tolkien, Howard kind of models of fantasy storytelling. And also, aside from George R. R. Martin, for better or for worse, I know a lot of people are, I know stuff's going down right now, but Neil Gaiman is probably the most influential fantasy writer working today, aside from George R. R. Martin. So, yeah, let's get past that. So, for the fifth and final book that I'll be talking about today for my fantasy recommendations, some introductory reads, is kind of an odd one, so bear with me. But my pick would be Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. If you want a book that can show you what fantasy can be, Alice in Wonderland is that book. It is one of those rare fantasy novels that commits itself completely to the fantastical. Tolkien often would say that really fantasy works if it makes sense, if the world makes sense. But Carroll showed that you don't have to do any of that. The whole point of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is that Wonderland makes no sense. It is as intense and strange and bizarre as the imagination can take it. And there's a lot of strange and bizarre characters who find their way into Alice's journey into Wonderland, such as the Red Queen, the Mad Hatter, the Rabbit, the Cheshire Cat, so many others that I could name. It's also just fun. It's a lot of fun to read, and there's a lot of really fun wordplay. It's probably the best linguistically out of all of the fantasy novels I've talked about here today. There's so many great wordplay. There's so much great, playing with language. Lewis Carroll was a genius, for whatever flaws he might have had. The guy really was a genius when it came to writing, and he also committed himself completely to showcasing a fantastical world, a world that was only as grand as his imagination would have allowed it. And it's kind of sad that not as many people really talk about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland on BookTube, and I've been guilty of this as well. I think it's a great book, but I just haven't covered it yet. And it's actually one I would like to reread before I cover it again. But anyway, but Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think, is probably the most unconventional fantasy on this list. I mean, Coraline is definitely unconventional as well, but I don't think people like Gaiman or any of the other people I mentioned in my Gaiman pick would even exist if it wasn't for Lewis Carroll to begin with. Because Lewis Carroll has this bizarre whimsy, but he also subverts whimsy at points. It gets really creepy at times. There's also some really nightmarish stuff in this book. And it's also a parable about growing up and what that means and why we need the imagination. It's very much a love letter to the imagination, and that's really what I would say that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is. It goes in so many different directions, it is completely unpredictable, and it commits itself wholly to freedom. And that's really the only way I would describe Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So, yeah, that's really all I have to say about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So, yeah. Well, that is all I have today for this episode of The Fate of Fantasy. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and hopefully, for any people who are curious about fantasy, this video has proven helpful. I'll link some videos down below if there's, for other videos of the type, if you find yourself dissatisfied with this and don't want to, read any of the books that I recommend, which, why? But anyway, let's get past that and get to the end of the video. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. As I like to say, like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. You can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on Goodreads and Letterboxd, where I write reviews that are probably more coherent than the one you just heard right now. You can also find me on Blue Sky, which I don't use very much, but I am starting to get the hang of, and Instagram. And you can also find me on... well, actually, that's it. Yeah. So anyway, like, subscribe, do all that stuff, as my friend John Minton likes to say. It feels good. And if you have recommendations for books that you should start out with in the fantasy genre, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. Love to hear from you guys. So, yeah, not really much else to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Fate of Fantasy. And until next time, I hope you guys enjoyed this. See you guys later. Bye-bye.